So far, we've done a lot of work with manipulating things on the two-dimensional plane, right? So we can move things along the horizontal x-axis, and we can move things along the vertical y-axis. And we've been doing all right with it so far. We've been getting some really nice-looking effects here just by manipulating things in 2 dimensions. Right now, we're going to ease ourselves into working with 3D space and manipulating things on a 3-dimensional plane. So that depth axis, that's a little bit hard for me to approximate with the mouse here, but we're going to take a look at it here in a minute. I recommend easing yourself into using 3-dimensional effects, or, well, not 3-dimensional effects, but rather just 3-dimensional transforms and manipulations. Just ease yourself into using them, because if you throw too many on at once and you're not very experienced with using and working in 3-dimensional space, it could look a little cheesy, and you could lose a lot of legibility and not really communicate your message quite as well. So I recommend using 3D sparingly, at least starting out, until you get your bearings. So that's why in this particular exercise here, we're not even going to use a 3-dimensional camera. So don't worry about the camera. We'll talk about 3-dimensional cameras here shortly. I know some of you may have done some tutorials before where you've seen people using cameras. We're actually going to do this without a camera, just to give you an idea of how you can ease yourself into 3-dimensional transforms, and how you can really add just a little bit of dimension and depth to something can really add a lot of visual quality to it. So I want you to start thinking in terms of how you can just ease yourself into this. So right now, this is this should look familiar to us. We've worked with this before. I've created a duplicate of our original composition, and I've actually stripped all of the animation out of it now. So it's still, we're back to this static picture here that we started out with, that we were animating before. Well, now I'm going to take this plane here, and I'm going to actually add a little bit of 3-dimensional animation to it to make it interesting, right? So we're going to have fun with that. Let me get rid of this speech bubble here so that we can just concentrate on animating the plane. And through this example, you'll get to see how you can easily start working with 3-dimensional space. Like I said, baby steps with 3-dimensional space, and you'll do just fine, and you'll come up with some really nicely designed pieces. So obviously we have our layers here, and we've worked with layers before, and we've animated them. We've done all these different things. We've worked with switches, right? So we have our motion blur switches. We have our rasterizing switches. We also have we can toggle between switches and modes, right? So some of you may be switched over to mode. If you are, click on this to get back over to the switches, so we can see all of this, right? So now we're in switches. Really, the only thing you need to do to make things conform to 3 dimensions. Right now we're at 2 dimensions, right? If I pull down transform. To make something conform to 3 dimensions, all we really need to do is check this cube here. And if we hold it down, it says a 3D layer. So we're telling it, okay, After Effects, we want this right here to be a 3-dimensional layer. And we want to be able to manipulate it with 3-dimensional properties. So go ahead and select that, and you'll notice, well, you get material properties down here. We're not going to have time to discuss that, but we're going to look at the transform properties, and you'll notice that now everything has 3 axes. So this additional axis is really the depth. It's the z-axis. So it's coming towards the camera, or really the point of view at this point. We don't have a camera. So it's coming towards the point of view that you're at, is this z dimension. So another thing you'll notice is that our layer now, if I switch this on and off, you'll notice we now have this arrow manipulator here. So if you've used 3D graphics programs like Maya, or you've used Blender, or you've used 3D Studio Max, you'll notice that this should look familiar to you. This is what we use in 3D graphics programs to manipulate things in space and move them around. So easily, by grabbing onto the red arrow, I can still move something horizontally. By grabbing on the Y, I can move it vertically. Right? But now, if you look here, it's a little tough to see, but there's this little blue dot here that specifies the z-axis and that arrow there. So I can actually grab that, and I can pull that towards and away from the camera. So this is really interesting, because what if I was to, instead of moving the position, what if I was to rotate along these axes on the manipulator? Then I'll get some really interesting effects. So we're going to explore that, and when we're going to animate by just moving these in space and keyframing them. So given our previous experience manipulating things and working with them in two-dimensional space, we're, and with this newfound thing that we have now with the manipulator, the 3D manipulator rather, we can really easily put this together visually in not a whole lot of time. I mean, it's the same principles that we've been working with so far. So getting this to work in 3D space, not a big deal. So why don't we go ahead and just add a subtle little bit of motion just to this plane, three-dimensional motion. Just start with baby steps, just to give it a little bit more visual interest. So let's go ahead here, and I'm going to grab this with the selection tool, right? If I grab this manipulator with the selection tool, I can move it back and forth, right? I want to bring it in really close to the camera, right? Make it really striking, really in your face, right? So let's make that, let's back it off just a little tiny bit. Bring it up like this. And then also something I'm interested in doing is also orienting it, or changing the orientation, right? So I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to select the rotation tool. What this allows me to do is it allows me to use the same manipulator, but use it as a rotation manipulator. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to rotate a little bit that way, and say I kind of want it to end up here, and give it a little bit of dimension and depth here, right? So there's that, and then yeah, I'm going to make it kind of bank just a little tiny bit, make it look zippy. So here we go. We got a fun, we got kind of this fun tilting, right, to make it cute, make it fun, and we can come down here, and I can bring it a little bit more towards the screen, right? Bring it down, bring it in even further, right? So now we're starting to manipulate on what we would call local space, right? So what's local to this plane. So now we've kind of got that positioned maybe where we want it to end up. Now it's going to be more of a question of where do we want it to start out? How do we want it to kind of move in 3D space when it starts out? So we're gonna address that next. So like any other transformation, we can keyframe this. So we've changed the position and we've changed the orientation. Note that we have orientation down here and we have rotation. And I don't think we have time to really go over the difference between orientation and rotation here, but let's just stick with manipulating the orientation for now. When you get to certain levels and certain activities, having two different ways to manipulate the rotation really comes in handy. But for now, I don't know, we're keeping things simple, so let's just work with orientation, which is what we get from using this rotation tool, right? So we've manipulated these and we've keyframed them, right? And also something you can note, you can also tweak things down here in the timeline if you're looking for very precise values. So basically what I want to do now is I want to bring the playhead back to the beginning, and then I want to give it a start point. So basically I'm going to take this and I'm going to push it off screen. So I'm going to get my selection tool, and I'm going to select this here, and I'm going to position it. I'm going to start kind of working with it and positioning it off screen. I want it to really come from far away and really have this dramatic effect to it. So why don't I go ahead and I'm going to push it really far back into space to make it look like it came from really far away so it could come to us. So what you're noticing here is I'm pushing it off screen, but I also get this bounding box, this visual cue of really where the piece exists. So sometimes you end up doing a lot of work off screen, and you end up playing with some of these parameters here off screen, and tweaking it and hoping for the best that it comes out the way that you want it. And you go ahead, you check yourself often, and then you just go back and forth to make sure you're getting it right. So I've positioned this off screen, so it's supposed to start off screen, and then as I scrub, it's supposed to come on screen, right? So there we go. Well, that's pretty neat. So let's go ahead and play it back and see kind of what we get. All right, here we go. That's pretty fun, right? So, with minimal effort, we've really added a lot more visual interest to this. Now, we haven't gone overboard crazy, and we haven't added too many 3D effects to it. We're just manipulating the position and the rotation on something, or rather the orientation, right? So we're just manipulating two properties, and we're manipulating them ever so slightly just to give them a little bit more depth, and just to make them a little bit more engaging. When things are pointing towards the viewer, or at least have this dimensional effect, then they can be a little bit more engaging in terms of marketing, and in terms of getting a certain idea across and being a little bit more pushy with your message. So that helps. Also, like anything else, we can go into our graph editor and we can apply easy ease to these keyframes. So that's something fun to consider. So now that we've manipulated that in the graph editor, we can go back and just remember 3D properties are like any other attribute or any other property that you're manipulating. You can go ahead and you can apply any of the past things that we've talked about to them. So right now we're looking at it and it's easing in and it's looking nice. So next up we're going to talk a little bit about 3D cameras.